Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Labor Day weekend 2019 was supposed to be perfect. My wife Jennifer and I had been planning this getaway for months. A quiet, long weekend at a lakefront cabin in northern Vermont with our 7-year-old daughter Lily. We both worked demanding jobs in Boston, me as an architect and Jen as a pediatric nurse, and we desperately needed to disconnect from the city chaos. The Airbnb looked idyllic in the photos, a cozy log cabin nestled among towering pines, with a private dock stretching into Crystal Lake. What we didn't know was that those same woods that promised peace and tranquility would become the backdrop for the most terrifying afternoon of our lives. The drive up took nearly 4 hours, winding through increasingly narrow roads as GPS led us deeper into the wilderness. Lily spent most of the trip pressed against the window, counting red barns and making up stories about the cows we passed. When we finally pulled into the gravel driveway, the place exceeded our expectations. The cabin sat on a gentle slope about 50 yards from the water, surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides. The nearest neighbor was at least a quarter-mile away. We couldn't even see their roof through the trees. The property manager had left the key in a lockbox, and as we stepped inside, the smell of cedar and old firewood immediately made us feel at home. Lily claimed the loft bedroom before we'd even finished unloading the car, her excited footsteps echoing overhead as she explored every corner of her new domain. Saturday morning started beautifully. We woke to the sound of loons calling across the misty lake, their haunting cries echoing between the mountains. After a lazy breakfast of pancakes and Vermont maple syrup, we spent the morning exploring the property. Lily discovered a family of chipmunks living under the dock and must have spent an hour trying to coax them out with pieces of granola. The water was still warm enough for swimming, and we took turns jumping off the dock while Jennifer lounged on the shore with her book. By noon, we were all pleasantly exhausted and hungry. Jen and I decided to prepare a big lunch: grilled chicken, corn on the cob, and a salad made with vegetables from the farmer's market we'd passed on the way up. While we worked in the kitchen, Lily played on the deck just outside, arranging pine cones and colored leaves she'd collected into elaborate patterns. The kitchen window gave us a clear view of the deck, but at some point during our meal prep, Lily must have wandered off. It couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. I was marinating the chicken while Jen chopped vegetables, and we were chatting about maybe renting kayaks the next day. When I glanced up to check on Lily, the deck was empty. Her pile of nature treasures sat abandoned on the picnic table. "Hey, where'd our little explorer go?" I asked Jen, not particularly concerned at first. Kids wander, especially in new places full of interesting things to discover. Jen wiped her hands on a dish towel and stepped out onto the deck, calling Lily's name. No response. The woods seemed to swallow her voice, leaving only the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. That's when the first flutter of worry started in my chest. Not panic yet, just that parental instinct that something needed checking. I walked around to the side of the cabin, expecting to find her crouched by the stone fire pit, or maybe down by the water's edge looking for minnows. Nothing. The property wasn't that big, maybe 2 acres total, and most of it was visible from the cabin. Jen headed toward the lake while I checked behind the small storage shed. Still no Lily. We kept calling her name, our voices growing louder and more urgent with each unanswered call. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The chicken sat forgotten on the counter as we expanded our search into the tree line. That's when I noticed something that made my heart skip. A narrow trail I hadn't seen before, barely visible between 2 massive oak trees. Fresh footprints in the soft earth, small ones that could only belong to a child. Without thinking, I plunged into the woods, following those tiny impressions while shouting Lily's name until my throat burned. The trail wound deeper into the forest than I expected, maybe 200 yards from the cabin. The canopy grew thicker, filtering the afternoon sun into dim, greenish light. Just as I was about to turn back and get Jen, I heard it. Lily's voice, high and clear, somewhere ahead. Relief flooded through me so intensely that my knees nearly buckled. But as I pushed through a cluster of mountain laurel, what I saw made every muscle in my body tense. There was Lily, standing next to a beat-up RV that looked like it had been abandoned decades ago. The thing was covered in rust and moss with cardboard taped over most of the windows, and she wasn't alone. A man stood beside her, probably in his late 40s, wearing a faded khaki vest with what looked like some kind of wildlife organization patches. He had thinning brown hair combed over a sunburned scalp, and when he smiled at me, I noticed one of his front teeth was chipped at an odd angle. His hand rested on Lily's shoulder, and something about the way his fingers gripped her small frame made my skin crawl. "Daddy!" Lily called out, waving excitedly. "Mr. Bradley was just about to show me the baby raccoons. He takes care of hurt animals." The man, Bradley apparently, extended his free hand toward me, that damaged smile never wavering. "You must be her father," he said in a voice that sounded like he'd been smoking since childhood. "Found her wandering near the old logging road. Dangerous for little ones out here, bears, coyotes, all sorts of predators." He emphasized that last word in a way that made my jaw clench. I ignored his outstretched hand and moved straight to Lily, pulling her against my side. "We've been looking everywhere for you, sweetheart. You know you can't wander off like that." The man's hand dropped slowly, and I caught a flash of something in his eyes. Annoyance? Anger? It disappeared quickly behind that practiced smile. "Was just telling her about my rehabilitation work," he continued, gesturing toward the RV. "Got some orphan babies in there that need round-the-clock care. Kids usually love seeing them." The door to the RV hung slightly open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. A smell wafted out, something chemical mixed with decay, like roadkill soaked in cleaning fluid. Every instinct screamed at me to get Lily away from this place. "That's kind of you," I said, keeping my voice steady while tightening my grip on Lily's hand. "But we need to get back. Her mother's worried." Bradley shifted his weight, subtly blocking our path back to the trail. Oh, but the little lady was so excited to see them. "Won't take but a minute. The babies are sleeping right in the first compartment. She can peek through the door." He reached for the RV handle, and that's when I noticed his fingernails, long, yellowed, with dirt caked so deep underneath it looked permanent. But what really caught my attention was the padlock hanging loose on a hasp that had been recently installed on the door. Why would you need a padlock on the outside of an animal rehabilitation vehicle? "Actually," Lily piped up, tugging on my hand, "Mr. Bradley already showed me inside. But Daddy, there weren't any animals. Just a mattress with straps on it and lots of pictures on the walls." The man's expression changed instantly, like someone had flipped a switch. The smile vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. His eyes darted between me and Lily, and I saw his right hand move slowly toward his vest pocket. "Smart little thing, isn't she?" he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Noticed all the details. The photos are of the animals I've saved, of course, and the restraints are for when they're injured, need to keep them still for treatment." But Lily shook her head, her voice matter-of-fact in that way only children can manage. "No. They were pictures of kids. Other kids like me. Some were crying." The words hit me like ice water. I scooped Lily up in one motion, her small body tight against my chest, and started backing away from Bradley and his RV. He took a step forward, and that's when I heard it. Jennifer's voice calling both our names much closer than I expected. Maybe 100 feet away, getting louder. Bradley heard it too. His hand paused halfway to his pocket, and something like panic flashed across his features. "You should go," he said quickly, that fake smile returning but not reaching his eyes. "Wouldn't want to worry the missus." He moved aside, no longer blocking the path, but I could feel him watching us as I carried Lily back toward the trail. Just before we disappeared into the laurel bushes, I glanced back. He was still standing there, one hand on the RV door, the other now holding what looked like a Polaroid camera. The lens was pointed directly at us. I practically ran through the woods, branches scratching at my arms, Lily bouncing against my shoulder. When we burst out of the tree line, Jennifer was standing by the cabin, phone in hand, probably seconds away from calling 911. The next hour was a blur of packing, explaining to Jennifer what happened while keeping Lily distracted, and calling the police. 2 Vermont state troopers arrived within 40 minutes. Apparently, they took reports of suspicious individuals around children very seriously in these parts. I led them back to where I'd found the RV, but it was gone. Only tire tracks in the soft earth and the lingering chemical smell proved it had ever been there. One of the troopers, a young woman named Officer Kowalski, took Lily aside and gently asked her to describe everything she'd seen. My daughter, bless her heart, remembered details I'd missed in my panic. A toolbox full of zip ties and rope, air fresheners hanging everywhere, probably to mask other smells, and a stack of those instant cameras on a shelf. Most disturbing, she remembered seeing children's clothing in a plastic bin, different sizes, like a costume box but sad. The officers exchanged meaningful looks when she mentioned the photographs on the walls, how some showed kids at playgrounds or coming out of schools, taken from far away like someone was hiding. 3 days later, after we'd cut our trip short and returned to Boston, Officer Kowalski called with an update. They'd found the RV abandoned at a rest stop near the Canadian border. The man I'd described, who'd called himself Bradley, was actually Theodore Hutchins, wanted in 3 states for attempted child abduction and luring. He'd been using various aliases and posing as everything from a youth soccer coach to, apparently, a wildlife rehabilitator. The photographs Lily saw were his collection, potential targets he'd been stalking across New England. They found DNA from at least 4 children in that RV, though thankfully, all were located safe with their families. Hutchins himself was picked up trying to cross into Quebec 2 weeks later. During his arrest, they found multiple fake IDs, children's toys, and a journal detailing his plans. Our cabin, it turned out, was on a list of rental properties he'd been monitoring, specifically ones rented by families with young children. The police believed he'd been living in the woods nearby for weeks, waiting for the right opportunity. If Jennifer hadn't started calling for us when she did, if I hadn't decided to check that trail, if Lily hadn't been brave enough to tell me what she'd seen inside that RV, I still wake up sometimes in a cold sweat, thinking about all the ways that afternoon could have ended differently. The stress from work had been eating me alive for months, so when my doctor suggested I take a break before I gave myself a heart attack, I actually listened. I was 38, working 70-hour weeks at a Manhattan advertising firm, and hadn't taken a real vacation in 3 years. That October weekend in 2023, I drove up to the Finger Lakes region, where I'd booked 2 nights at the Whitmore Inn, this old Victorian place that had just reopened after being closed for renovations. The website showed cozy rooms with antique furniture and promised a peaceful escape from modern life. I remember thinking how perfect it sounded. No meetings, no deadlines, just me and some old books I'd been meaning to read. The drive up took about 4 hours, and I felt the tension in my shoulders start to ease as the city skyline disappeared in my rearview mirror. I arrived around 5 in the evening, just as the autumn sun was painting everything gold. The inn sat on this huge property surrounded by maple trees, their leaves blazing orange and red. It was one of those grand old buildings from the 1890s, all turrets and wraparound porches, the kind of place that made you think of garden parties and ladies in long dresses. The parking lot was nearly empty, just my Toyota Camry and 2 other cars. When I walked into the lobby, the smell hit me first. Fresh paint mixed with something older, like wood polish and dust. The manager, a thin guy named Harold with glasses that kept sliding down his nose, checked me in with this nervous energy, explaining they'd only been open again for 2 weeks. He mentioned the renovations had taken longer than expected after the incident, but didn't elaborate. My room was on the 2nd floor, number 207, and Harold insisted on walking me up himself, pointing out the new sprinkler system and emergency exits along the way. After Harold left me alone in my room, I unpacked and decided to explore the inn before dinner. The hallways were lined with burgundy carpet that muffled every footstep, and the walls held these ornate sconces that cast weird shadows. Everything felt too quiet, like the building was holding its breath. I made my way down to the dining room, which they'd converted into more of a casual lounge area with leather chairs and a bar in the corner. The walls were covered in framed photographs, old black and whites showing the inn throughout different decades. There were pictures of grand parties, staff lined up on the front steps, guests playing croquet on the lawn. But one photo caught my attention immediately. It showed the hotel staff from what looked like the 1970s, about 20 people in uniform standing in front of the main entrance. Someone had scratched out one face completely, leaving deep gouges in the glass and photo underneath. It was a woman in a maid's uniform, standing in the back row. You could still see her hands clasped in front of her, but where her face should have been was just violent scratches. I stood there staring at that photo longer than I should have, trying to figure out why someone would deface it like that. The scratches weren't neat or careful. They were angry, almost frantic, like someone had taken a key or a knife to it in a rage. The other faces in the photo were perfectly clear. The stern-looking manager with his arms crossed, the kitchen staff in their white uniforms, the groundskeepers holding rakes. But this one woman had been erased with such violence that it made my skin prickle. I asked the bartender, a college-age kid named Tyler, about it when I ordered a whiskey. He just shrugged and said the photo had been like that when they reopened, that lots of old stuff had been damaged in the fire. When I pressed him about what fire, he got this uncomfortable look and mumbled something about it happening a couple years back, then suddenly needed to check something in the kitchen. I sat there nursing my drink, but I kept glancing back at that photo, at those savage scratches where a face should have been. Dinner was a lonely affair in that empty dining room. Besides me, there were only two other guests, an elderly couple who ate in silence at a corner table. The food was decent enough, some kind of pot roast with vegetables, but I barely tasted it. The whole atmosphere of the place had shifted for me after seeing that photo. Every creak of the old building, every flicker of the lights made me look up from my plate. Around 9 o'clock, I headed back to my room, exhausted from the drive and the weird energy of the place. The hallways were even quieter now, lit only by those dim sconces and the emergency exit signs. Room 207 was at the end of a long corridor, and as I walked, I noticed that most of the other rooms seemed unoccupied. No sounds of TVs, no light coming from under the doors. I told myself it was just the off-season, that business would pick up on weekends, but the emptiness felt oppressive, like the inn was too big for the handful of people rattling around inside it. I tried to settle in for the night, taking a hot shower and climbing into the four-poster bed with one of my books. The room was actually quite nice. Restored hardwood floors, a working fireplace I didn't bother to light, and tall windows overlooking the grounds. But I couldn't concentrate on reading. Every few minutes, I'd hear something. Footsteps in the hallway that would stop right outside my door, the faint sound of a vacuum cleaner running somewhere above me, which seemed odd for 10 at night. Then, around 11:30, came the first knock. It was soft, almost hesitant, like someone wasn't sure they had the right room. I called out asking who it was, but got no response. I waited a minute, then got up and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but I could see that the sconce directly across from my door was flickering, throwing shadows that danced on the burgundy wallpaper. I went back to bed, telling myself it was probably just Harold doing his rounds, checking on guests. The second knock came 20 minutes later, harder this time, more insistent. 3 sharp raps that made me jump. This time I didn't call out. I just crept to the door and pressed my eye to the peephole. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. There was a woman standing in the hallway, but she was facing away from my door, just standing there in a maid's uniform. The uniform looked old-fashioned, not like something modern hotel staff would wear. It was gray with a white apron, the kind you'd see in old movies. Her hair was pinned up in this severe bun, and she stood perfectly still, like she was waiting for something. I watched her for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, waiting for her to move, to turn around, to do something. Then the flickering sconce went out completely, plunging that section of hallway into darkness. When it flickered back on a moment later, she was gone. Not walking away, not turning a corner, just gone, like she'd never been there at all. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something new. The sound of keys jangling in the hallway, the squeak of a cleaning cart's wheels, that same vacuum cleaner running in the room above me. But it was the whispering that really got to me. It started around 2 in the morning, so faint I thought it might be the wind or the old radiator. But as I lay there in the dark, I could make out that it was definitely a voice, a woman's voice, speaking in these urgent, rushed sentences I couldn't quite understand. It seemed to be coming from inside the walls themselves, moving from one side of the room to the other. At one point, I turned on all the lights and actually pressed my ear to the wall, trying to make out what she was saying. The whispering stopped immediately, like whatever was making the sound knew I was listening. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. I sat on the edge of the bed until dawn, fully dressed, my car keys in my hand, fighting the urge to just bolt from the room and drive back to the city right then. When the sun finally came up, I ventured out of my room, desperate for coffee and some kind of normal human interaction. The dining room was serving continental breakfast, and Harold was there, looking even more nervous than he had the day before. His hands shook as he poured coffee, and he kept glancing toward the hallway like he expected someone to walk in. I asked him point blank if they had any female staff working the night shift. The coffee pot slipped in his hand, spilling hot liquid across the white tablecloth. As he frantically mopped it up with napkins, he insisted that no, absolutely not. They only had 2 night employees, himself and a maintenance man named Jorge. When I described what I'd seen, his face went pale. He tried to laugh it off, suggesting I must have been dreaming, that old buildings play tricks on people, but his voice cracked on the words. Then he leaned in close, glancing around to make sure we were alone, and whispered that maybe I should consider checking out early. He'd waive the cancellation fee, no questions asked. The way he said it, urgent and scared, told me he knew exactly what I'd seen. I didn't need to be told twice. I went straight back to my room to pack, throwing my clothes into my suitcase without even folding them. But as I was zipping it up, I noticed something that made me stop cold. There were marks on my door, scratches in the wood that definitely hadn't been there the night before. They were concentrated around the lock and door handle, deep gouges like someone had been trying desperately to get in. Or maybe, I thought with a chill, trying to get out. I ran my fingers over them, and that's when I noticed the pattern. They weren't random. They formed letters carved roughly into the painted wood. L-E-T. Then a gap where the wood was too damaged to read, then O-U-T. Let out. Or maybe it had once said, let me out. I grabbed my suitcase and practically ran down the hallway, not caring how it looked. In the lobby, Harold already had my receipt ready, avoiding eye contact as he handed it over. As I was heading for the door, he called after me, his voice barely above a whisper. Room 207, he said. That's where it happened. We thought the renovations would fix it. I drove away from that place like the devil was chasing me, but I couldn't let it go. That afternoon, safe in my Manhattan apartment, I started digging online. It took some searching, but I finally found it. A small article in a local Finger Lakes newspaper from 2018. Historic Whitmore Inn damaged in fatal fire. The article was brief, but the details made my skin crawl. A maid named Dorothy Brennan had died in the blaze, trapped in a guest room on the 2nd floor. The fire had started in room 207 under suspicious circumstances, and Dorothy had been found inside, though she wasn't supposed to be there. The article mentioned an ongoing investigation into allegations that the inn's owner, Robert Whitmore, had been withholding wages and threatening to fire staff who complained. Dorothy had been one of the most vocal critics, organizing other employees to demand their back pay. The night of the fire, she'd supposedly been locked in room 207 after a confrontation with Whitmore. He claimed it was an accident, that he didn't know she was in there when he locked up for the night. The fire started 2 hours later. They found her body by the door, her fingers bloody from clawing at the wood. I've never been back to the Finger Lakes region, and I never will. Sometimes I still dream about that hallway, about the woman in the gray uniform standing with her back to me, waiting. I looked up Harold's name a few months later, just out of curiosity. He'd quit the Whitmore Inn just 2 weeks after my stay. The place closed again 6 months later, permanently this time. The last review I found online was from a woman who'd stayed in room 209, 2 doors down from where I'd been. She wrote about hearing a woman crying in the walls, about finding scratches on her door, about seeing a maid who vanished when the lights went out. But what really haunted me was her mention of the staff photo in the dining room. She said someone had scratched out a face so violently that the glass had cracked, and underneath the scratches, you could just make out a name tag that read Dorothy. I knew then that I'd seen her, that she was still there in that inn, still trying to get out of room 207, still desperate for someone to hear her. And I think about Harold's words, that they thought the renovations would fix it. But you can't renovate away that kind of pain, that kind of injustice. Some things refuse to be painted over or torn down. Some things just keep knocking, hoping someone will finally let them out. Termine. The summer of 2018 was supposed to be the beginning of everything for me and Allison. We'd just gotten married after dating for 4 years, and I'd saved up enough working construction to give her the honeymoon she deserved. She'd always dreamed of visiting wine country, talking about it constantly while we planned the wedding. So when I found this boutique vineyard estate up in Northern California, nestled between rolling hills covered in grapevines, I knew it was perfect. The place was called Blackwood Estate, family-owned for 3 generations according to their website. We arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, both of us giddy with excitement as we drove up the long gravel driveway lined with oak trees that must have been there for centuries. The estate was even more beautiful than the photos suggested. The main building was this stunning Mediterranean-style villa with terracotta tiles and ivy crawling up the walls. Our suite overlooked endless rows of grapevines that seemed to glow golden in the afternoon sun. Allison kept squeezing my hand and saying she couldn't believe we were actually there. The staff greeted us with champagne and fresh strawberries, and the owner himself, Mr. Blackwood, came out to welcome us personally. He was this dignified older gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes who told us about the estate's history while we sipped our drinks. Everything felt magical, like we'd stepped into a fairy tale. That first night we had dinner on our private balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky purple and orange while we talked about our future. The next few days passed in a blur of wine tastings, gourmet meals, and long walks through the vineyard. Allison was in heaven, taking notes on every wine we tried in this little leather journal she'd bought specifically for the trip. She'd always been the organized one in our relationship, documenting everything. The estate offered these intimate tasting sessions in their cellar, where they'd bring out vintages that weren't available to the public. We met other couples too, mostly older folks celebrating anniversaries, and everyone seemed genuinely happy to be there. But on our 4th day, Thursday evening, Allison started complaining about feeling queasy during dinner. She barely touched her food, which was unusual because she'd been raving about the chef's cooking since we arrived. I figured maybe she'd had too much wine during the afternoon tasting session. Friday morning she seemed better, so we went ahead with our scheduled activities. The estate was hosting this exclusive wine pairing event that evening, something they only did once a month for guests. There would be 7 courses, each paired with a different wine from their private collection. Allison was excited despite still feeling a bit under the weather. She kept saying she didn't want to miss it, that we'd paid too much money to skip anything. Around noon, I noticed she looked pale while we were touring the production facility. The guide was explaining the fermentation process when Allison grabbed my arm and whispered that she needed to sit down. Her skin felt clammy, and there was this sheen of sweat on her forehead, even though it wasn't particularly warm in there. I wanted to take her back to our room, but she insisted she just needed some water and fresh air. The wine pairing dinner started at 7. We dressed up for it. Allison wore this navy blue dress I'd bought her for her birthday, and she looked beautiful despite being obviously unwell. The dining room was intimate, maybe 12 guests total, with candles everywhere and soft classical music playing. Each table had handwritten menu cards detailing the evening's selections. The first course came out, seared scallops with a crisp Sauvignon Blanc, and I watched Allison force herself to take small bites. By the third course, she'd stopped eating entirely and was just pretending to sip her wine. I kept asking if she wanted to leave, but she shook her head each time, not wanting to make a scene. The woman at the next table, Mrs. Ashford from Oregon, kept glancing over with concern. Even in the dim candlelight, I could see Allison's complexion had taken on this grayish tinge that made my chest tight with worry. Then it happened during the 5th course. The server had just placed a plate of braised lamb in front of us when Allison suddenly lurched forward. Her whole body convulsed, and then she was vomiting violently onto the white tablecloth. But it wasn't normal vomit. It was dark, almost black, with streaks of bright red blood mixed in. The entire dining room erupted in chaos. Chairs scraped against the floor as people jumped back. Someone screamed, and Allison kept heaving, more blood coming up with each spasm. I remember holding her hair back, feeling completely helpless as her body shook. The sommelier dropped an entire tray of glasses, the crash adding to the pandemonium. Mr. Blackwood came running from the kitchen, his face white with shock. Allison collapsed against me, blood still dripping from her mouth, her dress ruined, her eyes rolling back. I was screaming for someone to call 911, my voice cracking with panic. The ambulance arrived within 15 minutes, though it felt like hours. The paramedics worked quickly, getting Allison onto a stretcher while asking me rapid-fire questions about what she'd eaten, any medications she was taking, allergies, everything. I rode with her to the hospital, holding her hand while she drifted in and out of consciousness. The emergency room was a blur of white coats and machines beeping. They pumped her stomach, ran blood tests, started IVs. I sat in that waiting room for what seemed like an eternity, still in my dinner jacket stained with her blood. A doctor finally came out around midnight, Dr. Patel, I'll never forget his name, and the look on his face made my knees weak. He said they'd found traces of warfarin in her system, massive amounts of it. Rat poison, he explained, seeing my confusion. Someone had been poisoning my wife with rat poison, and based on the levels, it had been going on for days. The police arrived before dawn, 2 detectives who looked like they'd been pulled out of bed, which they probably had. They questioned me for hours, wanting to know every detail of our stay, everyone we'd interacted with, everything Allison had consumed. Had we made any enemies? Did anyone have a grudge against us? The questions seemed absurd. We were just a young couple from Colorado on our honeymoon. Who would want to hurt Allison? The detectives then turned their attention to the estate, interviewing staff, reviewing security footage, testing food samples from the kitchen. The whole place was in lockdown. Other guests were being examined at the hospital as a precaution, though thankfully no one else showed symptoms. I stayed by Allison's bedside, watching her sleep, tubes and wires connected to her body, machines monitoring her vitals. The doctors said she was lucky. If we'd waited even another hour, she might not have made it. 3 days later, they caught him. A former employee named Mitchell Granger who'd been fired from the estate 6 months earlier for stealing wine from the cellar. The security footage showed him sneaking into the kitchen through a service entrance late at night, using a key he'd never returned. He'd been living in his van in the woods nearby, watching the estate, waiting. The police found journals in his vehicle filled with rambling notes about revenge, about how the Blackwood family had ruined his life, how he was going to make them pay by destroying their reputation. He'd been adding small amounts of warfarin to random dishes, not targeting anyone specific, just playing Russian roulette with guests' lives. Allison just happened to be the unlucky one who got enough doses over several days for it to build up to toxic levels. When they arrested him, he was reportedly calm, almost proud of what he'd done. The detective told me Granger had worked there for 8 years before the theft, knew every inch of that kitchen, every security blind spot. The estate shut down immediately for a full investigation. Health inspectors came in. The FBI got involved because it crossed state lines with guests from all over. Lawsuits started flying. We heard later that 3 other guests had trace amounts of warfarin in their systems, but not enough to cause symptoms. The Blackwood family was devastated. 3 generations of building their reputation destroyed in a single week. Allison spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering, and even after she was released, it took months for her to feel normal again. The bleeding had damaged her stomach lining, and she had to follow a special diet for half a year. We never got to finish our honeymoon. Instead, we spent it in hospital rooms and giving depositions. The thing that haunts me most is how random it was. We weren't targeted. We were just there at the wrong time, eating the wrong meals, victims of one man's twisted need for revenge against people who had nothing to do with us. The trial happened a year later. We had to fly back to California to testify, and seeing that courthouse brought everything flooding back. Granger pleaded guilty to attempted murder and got 25 years. He showed no remorse, just sat there with this blank expression, while Allison described what it felt like to think she was dying on what should have been the happiest week of her life. The Blackwood estate never reopened. Last I heard, the property was for sale, the vineyards overgrown, the beautiful villa empty. Sometimes I drive past wineries here in Colorado, and Allison will tense up, her hand finding mine. She can't drink wine anymore, not because of any medical reason, but because the smell alone brings her back to that dining room. We still have the little leather journal she brought on the trip, filled with her tasting notes from those first few days when everything was perfect. She's never opened it since. We ended up having a second honeymoon 2 years later, just a simple road trip through the mountains, staying in little bed and breakfasts where we could see who was cooking our food. Allison's okay now, physically at least. The doctors monitor her liver function yearly because of the warfarin damage, but she's healthy. We don't talk about it much, but sometimes I catch her reading news stories about food poisoning cases, her face tight with a fear I wish I could erase. What happened at Blackwood Estate taught us that horror doesn't always come from dark alleys or obvious threats. Sometimes it comes from a beautiful place where you're supposed to be safe, served on fine china with a wine pairing. We learn to be grateful for boring, uneventful meals, for trips where nothing happens worth remembering except being together. That's enough for us now. Melissa had just gotten promoted to senior accountant when we decided to take that trip to Myrtle Beach. 12 years of marriage, and we'd barely taken any real vacations together. I was pulling double shifts at the hospital, she was drowning in spreadsheets, and we both knew we needed to get away before we burned out completely. We found this resort online. 3 stars, decent reviews, nothing special except for the ocean view rooms. Room 312 was ours, 3rd floor, with a tiny balcony where you could hear the waves at night if you really listened. The place had that particular smell all beach hotels have, a mix of chlorine, salt air, and whatever industrial strength cleaner they use on the carpets. The walls were thin enough that you could hear toilets flushing 2 rooms over, but we didn't care. We were just happy to be somewhere that wasn't home or work. Everything seemed normal that first day. We checked in around 3 in the afternoon, unpacked our stuff, and went straight down to the beach. The sand was hot enough to burn your feet, and the water was that perfect temperature where you don't want to get out. Other guests were scattered around, families with kids building sandcastles, couples walking hand in hand, the usual beach crowd. When we got back to our room that evening, sunburned and exhausted, I noticed the door to room 314 had a "Do Not Disturb" sign hanging from the handle. Didn't think much of it at the time. People go on vacation to relax, right? Maybe they were sleeping off jet lag or just wanted privacy. Melissa and I ordered room service, watched some terrible reality show on the tiny TV, and fell asleep to the sound of the air conditioner rattling. The next morning, that sign was still there. Same position, same angle, like nobody had touched it. We passed by room 314 on our way to breakfast, and I found myself slowing down, listening for any sounds from inside. Nothing. Complete silence. The breakfast buffet was your typical hotel spread. Rubbery eggs, soggy bacon, those tiny boxes of cereal. We sat by the window and Melissa was going on about maybe renting bikes later when I mentioned the room next door. She just shrugged, said maybe they were heavy sleepers or had the "Do Not Disturb" sign up by accident. But something about it bothered me. The sign itself was weird. Not the standard hotel cardboard kind, but this laminated thing with faded colors, like it had been hanging there for months. The edges were yellowed and curling, and there was this water stain in the corner that looked like an old coffee ring. That night, around 2 in the morning, I woke up to this sound. At first I thought it was coming from outside, maybe someone dragging a beach chair across the concrete by the pool. But as I lay there in the dark, listening more carefully, I realized it was coming through the wall. From room 314. This slow, deliberate dragging sound, like someone was pulling something heavy across the carpet. It would go on for maybe 30 seconds, then stop. Complete silence for a few minutes. Then it would start again. I nudged Melissa, but she just mumbled something and rolled over. The sound continued on and off for about an hour. Each time it started, I'd hold my breath, trying to figure out what it could be. Furniture? Luggage? The rhythm was always the same. Drag, pause, drag, pause. Around 3:30 it finally stopped, and I managed to fall back asleep, though I kept having these dreams about someone trying to move a refrigerator down a long hallway. Wednesday morning, the sign was still there. By now, I was getting genuinely curious. 3 days and I hadn't seen a single person go in or out of that room. No maid service, no room service trays in the hallway. Nothing. Even the peephole looked dusty, like nobody had touched that door in weeks. I mentioned it to Melissa over coffee at the beach bar, and she finally admitted it was a bit strange. We decided to pay attention, see if we could catch whoever was staying there. But the whole day passed. We went parasailing, had lunch at this seafood place down the boardwalk, came back for an afternoon swim, and that door never opened. Not once. I even made excuses to walk past it several times. The sign never moved, not even a slight swing from the air conditioning kicking on. It was like it was glued to the handle. The dragging sounds came back that night, but this time they were different. Louder, more urgent somehow. And there was something else. This wet sound, like someone mopping up a spill. Drag, splash, drag, splash. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it. Melissa woke up this time, grabbed my arm in the dark. "What is that?" she whispered. We both listened, barely breathing. The sounds went on for maybe 20 minutes, then stopped abruptly. Just like that. Dead silence. We waited, but nothing else happened. In the morning, I decided I'd had enough. While Melissa was in the shower, I walked out into the hallway and stood in front of room 314. The sign was exactly the same, but now I noticed something else. There was this smell, faint but definitely there. Sweet and sour at the same time, like fruit that had been left out too long. I bent down and it seemed to be coming from under the door. That's when I saw it. A dark stain on the carpet, just barely visible where it met the door frame. It looked wet, but when I touched it with my shoe, it was completely dry. I went straight to the front desk. The woman working there had this name tag that said Brenda and glasses on a chain around her neck. She smiled at me with too much enthusiasm for 8 in the morning. I explained about the room next door, the sounds, the smell, how I hadn't seen anyone in days. Her smile never wavered, but something shifted in her eyes. She typed something into her computer, frowned, typed again. "Sir, room 314 has been vacant all week," she said, turning the monitor so I could see. The reservation system showed it clearly. Empty since the previous Sunday. My skin prickled. I insisted someone was in there, told her about the sounds, the sign that never moved. She picked up the phone, called someone named Gary from maintenance. While we waited, she kept giving me these sideways glances, like she was trying to decide if I was crazy. or just a troublesome guest. Gary showed up 10 minutes later, this older guy with a tool belt and keys jangling from his hip like he was a medieval jailer. Brenda whispered something to him, and his face went serious. We all went up to the 3rd floor together. I stood back while Gary knocked on the door to 314. "Maintenance, anyone in there?" No answer. He knocked again, louder. Nothing. He looked at Brenda, who nodded, and he pulled out his master key. The lock clicked open, but the door only moved about 2 inches before hitting something. Gary pushed harder, grunting with effort. Whatever was blocking it scraped across the floor with a sound I recognized immediately. The same dragging noise I'd been hearing at night. Finally, he got it open enough to squeeze through. I'll never forget his face when he came back out. All the color had drained away and his hands were trembling as he pulled out his radio. "We need to call the police," he said. "Now." The police arrived within 15 minutes. 2 uniforms first, then detectives, then crime scene techs in white suits. They sealed off the entire 3rd floor, moving all the guests to different rooms. Melissa and I were taken to a small conference room near the lobby, where a detective named Barnes asked us questions for over an hour. When did we first notice the sounds? Had we seen anyone suspicious? Did we smell anything unusual? I answered everything, watching him scribble notes in this little pad. He wouldn't tell us what they'd found, just kept asking the same questions different ways. Other guests were being interviewed too. I could see them through the glass door, looking confused and scared. The hotel manager showed up, this nervous man who kept dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief, even though the air conditioning was blasting. By noon, there were news vans in the parking lot. It wasn't until that evening that we learned what had happened. Barnes came back to talk to us one more time, and maybe because we were the ones who'd reported it, he gave us more details than he probably should have. Someone had used a stolen keycard to enter room 314 5 days earlier. The security footage showed a man in a baseball cap and sunglasses wheeling in a large suitcase. He never came back out, at least not through the front. They found a body under the bed, a woman, probably in her 30s, who'd been dead for several days. The dragging sounds I'd heard? The killer had been moving her body around the room, trying different hiding spots. The wet sounds were from the ice bucket. He'd been using ice to try to slow down decomposition. The smell I'd noticed was exactly what I'd feared it was. Barnes said the man must have been coming back at night through the sliding door from the balcony, using the adjacent room's balcony to climb over. They were still looking for him. We packed up that night. There was no way we could stay, not with crime scene tape 3 doors down and reporters trying to interview guests in the hallway. The hotel offered to comp our stay and put us up somewhere else, but we just wanted to go home. As we loaded our bags into the car, I kept glancing up at the 3rd floor. Room 314's curtains were drawn, but I could see the flash of camera equipment through the gaps. Melissa didn't say much during the drive back to Illinois. We both knew there was nothing to say that would make it better. She held my hand the whole way, squeezing it whenever we passed a hotel billboard on the interstate. The vacation we'd needed so badly had turned into something neither of us would ever forget, no matter how much we wanted to. They caught the guy 3 weeks later at a truck stop in Tennessee. His name was James Hoffman, and the woman was his ex-girlfriend who'd apparently threatened to expose some financial fraud he was involved in. He'd planned the whole thing for months, studying the hotel's routines, stealing the key card from a housekeeper's cart. What still haunts me is knowing he was there the whole time, just one room over, probably listening to us through the walls the same way I was listening to him. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking I hear that dragging sound, but it's just the ceiling fan or the cat walking around. Melissa and I still take vacations, but we stay in different places now. Rental houses, bed and breakfasts, anywhere but hotels. And whenever I see a "Do Not Disturb" sign that looks like it's been hanging too long, I remember that sweet, sour smell and the sound of Gary's voice when he came out of that room. Some things you just can't unsee, even if you never actually saw them. So I'm sharing this because I still get chills thinking about it, and maybe someone else has experienced something similar. I'm Amanda, 34, work as a graphic designer from home in Wisconsin. This whole thing happened last March during what was supposed to be my perfect solo getaway. I'd been going through a rough patch after my divorce was finalized, and my therapist suggested I take some time for myself. You know how it is. Working from home gets lonely, especially when you're trying to rebuild your life. I'd been browsing those vacation rental sites for weeks, looking for something quiet and secluded where I could just disconnect from everything. The mountains of North Carolina seemed perfect, far enough from my usual routine, but not so remote that I'd feel completely cut off from civilization. I needed space to think, to write in my journal, maybe do some hiking. Just me, some books, and hopefully some peace of mind. The cabin I found looked like something straight out of a Pinterest board, all wood beams and stone fireplace, perched on this hillside with huge windows overlooking the valley. The listing showed this cozy kitchen with exposed brick, a loft bedroom, and a wraparound deck where I could drink my morning coffee while watching the sunrise. The owner, some guy named Kevin, had great reviews and responded to my messages super quickly. The whole booking process was smooth as butter. He explained that the cabin had a keypad lock system, no physical keys to worry about losing or picking up from anyone. He'd send me the code a few days before my arrival. It seemed perfect for someone like me who tends to overthink logistics. The photos showed deer wandering through the property, and I could already picture myself sitting on that deck with my laptop, finally getting some clarity about what I wanted to do with my life post-divorce. The drive up to the cabin was exactly what I needed. I'd left Milwaukee early that Friday morning, and by the time I reached the winding mountain roads, I could feel my shoulders starting to relax for the first time in months. The GPS kept losing signal, but Kevin had sent detailed directions along with the door code, 4729. I remember thinking how nice it was that he trusted guests with such a simple system. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by towering pines and rhododendron bushes that were just starting to bloom. When I punched in the code and heard that satisfying click of the lock disengaging, I felt this wave of relief wash over me. The place was even more beautiful than the photos. Everything smelled like cedar and wood smoke, and the afternoon light streaming through those big windows made everything look golden. I spent the first evening unpacking my things, making myself a simple dinner, and just soaking in the quiet. No traffic, no neighbors arguing through thin walls, just the sound of wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. Saturday was perfect in every way. I woke up naturally around 7, made coffee on the little stovetop, and sat on the deck watching the mist rise from the valley below. I'd brought a stack of books I'd been meaning to read, and I actually managed to get through half of one without checking my phone every 10 minutes. For lunch, I drove into the nearest town, about 20 minutes down the mountain, and found this little diner where the waitress called me Honey, and the pie was homemade. I picked up some groceries for dinner and wine for later, feeling more relaxed than I had in years. The afternoon was spent hiking a trail that started right from the cabin's backyard, and I even saw a family of deer grazing in a clearing, just like in the photos. By evening, I was tired in that good way that comes from fresh air and exercise. I cooked myself a nice dinner, opened that bottle of wine, and settled in to watch the sunset paint the mountains purple and orange. I remember thinking this was exactly what I needed. Just me, nature, and time to figure things out. That night I went to bed around 10:30, which was early for me but felt right in that peaceful environment. The loft bedroom had this amazing skylight, where I could see stars, real stars, not the faint dots you get in the city. I'd left one of the downstairs windows cracked open because the mountain air was so crisp and clean, and I loved falling asleep to the sound of the wind moving through the pine branches. The bed was comfortable, with these heavy quilts that made me feel cocooned and safe. I'd been having trouble sleeping since the divorce, but that night, I felt myself drifting off easily for the first time in months. I had this vague awareness of the cabin settling around me, those little creaks and sighs that old wooden buildings make. Everything felt right with the world. I was finally somewhere I could just be myself without any pressure or expectations. The wine had left me pleasantly drowsy, and I remember my last conscious thought being gratitude for finding such a perfect place to heal. Sunday night was when everything changed. I'd had another wonderful day, more hiking, more reading, a long phone call with my sister where I actually sounded happy for the first time in months. I'd made myself a simple pasta dinner and finished the bottle of wine from the night before, feeling proud of how well I was handling this whole solo retreat thing. I went to bed around 11, maybe a little later, feeling that same peaceful tiredness from the night before. The thing is, I'm usually a pretty deep sleeper, especially when I'm relaxed like I was that weekend. But something woke me up around 2 in the morning, this weird electronic sound that seemed to come from downstairs. At first, I thought maybe it was the cabin's heating system or the refrigerator cycling on. You know how rental places always have their quirks. But then I heard it again, and it was distinctly different from the normal house sounds I'd gotten used to. It was a series of beeps, followed by a mechanical clicking noise that made my heart skip a beat. In my sleepy state, it took me a few seconds to realize what I was hearing, the sound of the keypad lock being activated. The moment that realization hit me, every muscle in my body went rigid. I lay there in the loft bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I was mistaken. Maybe it was just a dream, or maybe Kevin had mentioned something about automatic systems that I'd forgotten. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door opening, that particular squeak of the hinges that I'd noticed when I first arrived. My heart started pounding so hard I was sure whoever was down there would hear it. I wanted to call out, to ask who was there, but my voice seemed to have completely disappeared. The logical part of my brain was racing through possibilities. Maybe Kevin had forgotten to tell me about maintenance. Maybe there was some kind of emergency. But it was 2 in the morning, and every instinct I had was screaming that this wasn't right. I could hear soft footsteps now, deliberate and careful, moving across the hardwood floor downstairs. They weren't the heavy boots of a maintenance worker or the hurried steps of someone dealing with an emergency. These were quiet, almost sneaky footsteps, like someone trying not to wake me up. I forced myself to slip out of bed as quietly as possible, my bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor of the loft. The cabin's layout meant I could see part of the downstairs from the loft railing, but I'd have to creep forward to get a clear view. Every step felt like it was echoing through the whole building, even though I was trying to move like a ghost. The footsteps below had stopped, which somehow made everything worse. At least when I could hear them, I knew where the person was. Now they could be anywhere. I made it to the railing and slowly, carefully peered down into the main living area. The moonlight coming through those big windows cast everything in silver and shadow, making familiar furniture look strange and threatening. I could see the kitchen area, the stone fireplace, the couch where I'd been reading just hours before, but I couldn't see anyone. The footsteps started again, moving toward the kitchen, and I realized I needed to get to a better vantage point. The bathroom was at the top of the stairs, and its door had a small gap that would let me see into the kitchen without being visible myself. I crept toward the bathroom on trembling legs, each step taking forever as I tried to avoid the floorboards I'd noticed creaking during the day. The door was slightly ajar, and I positioned myself behind it, pressing my eye to the gap. From this angle, I had a clear view of the kitchen counter and the area near the back door. At first, I saw nothing but shadows and the faint outline of the appliances I'd been using all weekend. But then, a figure moved into my line of sight, and my entire world shifted. It was a man, medium height, wearing dark clothes that made him blend into the shadows. He wasn't rushing around or searching for something. He was just standing there, completely still, like he was listening. His posture was casual, almost comfortable, like he belonged there. What terrified me most was how familiar he seemed to be with the space. He moved around the kitchen island without bumping into anything, opened the refrigerator without fumbling for the handle, and I watched him take out the leftover pasta I'd made for dinner. He stood there eating it with his fingers straight from the container, like he was in his own home. The whole scene was so surreal and violating that I almost couldn't process it. This stranger was in what had been my safe space, eating my food. treating the place like it was his personal kitchen. I watched him finish the pasta, rinse the container in the sink, and put it back in the refrigerator, methodically, like he'd done this before. Then he did something that made my skin crawl. He walked over to the couch where I'd been reading and sat down in the exact spot where I'd spent the afternoon. He picked up my book, the one I'd left on the coffee table, and started flipping through it. Not reading, just turning pages like he was looking for something specific. The casual way he handled my personal belongings made me feel sick. After a few minutes, he set the book down exactly where he'd found it and stood up. I thought he was going to leave, and I was already planning how I'd barricade the door once he was gone. But instead, he walked toward the stairs, toward me, and I realized with growing horror that he might be planning to come up to the loft. I backed away from the bathroom door as quietly as possible, my heart hammering against my ribs. The thought of being trapped in the loft with this stranger coming up the stairs was unbearable. I could hear his footsteps on the first few steps, slow and deliberate, and I knew I had maybe 30 seconds before he reached the top. My phone was on the nightstand next to the bed, and I had to make a choice, try to grab it and call for help or find somewhere to hide. I chose the phone, tiptoeing across the loft as fast as I dared. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen, and when I saw I had no signal, I wanted to cry. The footsteps had stopped about halfway up the stairs, and I could hear him breathing. Just breathing, like he was deciding what to do next. I clutched my phone anyway, thinking maybe I could use it as a weapon if I had to. Then suddenly the footsteps started going back down. I heard him walk across the living room, and a few seconds later, the front door opened and closed. Just like that, he was gone. I stayed hidden in the loft for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. When the first hints of dawn started creeping through the skylight, I finally worked up the courage to check the house. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, except for the pasta container in the fridge and the slightly different position of my book. I drove straight to the nearest town and called the police from a diner, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what had happened. The officer who came to meet me was this older guy named Detective Morrison, who actually took me seriously. He followed me back to the cabin and found no signs of forced entry, which made sense since the person had used the keypad. When we called Kevin, the owner, he was genuinely shocked and confused, but then Detective Morrison had him check his rental records, and that's when we discovered the truth. The access code 4729 had been used for the same cabin 6 months earlier by a guest named Thomas Brennan. Kevin had forgotten to change the code between bookings, and somehow this Thomas guy had figured out the pattern or remembered it. The detective tracked him down. He lived about an hour away, and when they questioned him, he admitted he'd been coming back to the cabin periodically, treating it like his own personal retreat. He claimed he never meant to scare anyone, and only came when he thought the place was empty. They charged him with breaking and entering, but the whole thing still gives me chills. I never went back to that cabin, and I always ask about security protocols now when I book places. Some experiences change you, and that night definitely changed how safe I feel in unfamiliar places. I'd just wrapped up a brutal midterm week, and honestly, all I wanted was to get away for a couple of days. My roommate Marcus had the exact same idea. We weren't particularly close, more like default friends thanks to shared space. But we got along well enough to not kill each other on a road trip. He suggested we hit Arizona, find somewhere quiet, maybe hike a bit. Nothing big, just a break from the campus chaos. I remember throwing a backpack together with barely any thought, some clothes, a portable charger, and a gas station bag full of snacks. I wasn't expecting the trip to be memorable. Turns out it was, for the worst reasons possible. We didn't make any real plans, just drove west, letting the roads decide for us. Around sunset, we passed through a stretch of highway with nothing but red dust and power lines. That's when we saw it. A squat little motel just off the road. Faded red sign flickering like it had better days. Desert Palms Inn. though most of the neon was shot. Marcus pulled in without asking. "Better than driving through the night," he said, already grabbing his bag. The lot was nearly empty, which didn't surprise me. The office looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s, but the old guy behind the counter was friendly enough. Gave us room 6, right at the edge of the building. That first night was weird, but not in a horror movie way. More like subtle weird. Marcus kept saying he felt watched. He wasn't the paranoid type, but he locked the bathroom door before his shower, even though it was just the two of us. I brushed it off. I was too tired to care. But I remember waking up around 2 a.m. to what I thought was the sound of footsteps outside. Not fast, slow, dragging steps, like someone walking with weight. I stayed still, listening. Nothing else. I figured it was an animal, or the wind pushing something along the gravel. When I got up the next morning, Marcus was gone. His bag was gone, his side of the bed was made, and the motel room key was sitting neatly on the desk. At first, I assumed he'd gone to get breakfast, maybe explore the area. But when it got close to noon and I hadn't heard anything, I started asking around. I went to the front office and the same old guy was there. I asked if he'd seen Marcus. He didn't even hesitate. Just nodded and said, "Your friend checked out early this morning. Left around 6, said he had to get home." The way he said it, no eye contact, no expression, just flat, made something twist in my chest. Marcus didn't even have a car. We drove together. I told the man at the front desk that Marcus wouldn't just leave without telling me, that we were sharing a car, and that he hadn't mentioned a single word about going home early. He gave a vague shrug and said maybe Marcus called a ride, that people change plans all the time. I didn't buy it. I asked to see the camera footage from that morning, but he claimed the system was old and spotty, and that it only recorded during certain hours. It felt like he had rehearsed that response. Still, I tried to keep my cool. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe Marcus really did catch a ride or had some kind of emergency. But something about how quiet the place was, and how quickly the man shut the conversation down, stuck with me. I stayed one more night, mostly out of indecision. I figured if Marcus didn't text or call by morning, I'd go to the police. That second night was worse. I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard a strange metallic rattling, like chains being dragged or a latch being tested. It came from somewhere behind the motel. When I peeked out the window, I noticed a shed I hadn't seen before. It was far enough from the building that you wouldn't notice it unless you were looking for it. A single bulb hung over the door, flickering, but I could make out the outline of someone standing near it, not moving, just there. The next morning, I packed up and drove straight to the nearest police station. I told them everything, how Marcus was gone, how the guy at the front desk acted, how weird the second night had been. I gave them the name of the motel, the room number, everything. They didn't say much at first. Took down the information, told me they'd look into it. I drove back to campus alone, trying to convince myself it was just a weird trip and that Marcus would show up eventually, pissed I made a fuss. But he never did. Days passed, then a week, then 2. His phone stayed off. His family filed a missing person report. It wasn't until almost a month later that I got a call from a detective. He asked me to come in. When I did, he told me, quietly, carefully, that Marcus wasn't the only person who had disappeared from that motel. Over the last year, at least 6 others had gone missing after checking in. Always one person at a time, always late check-ins. And every time the staff had some excuse, early checkout, emergency. Nobody remembers anything. The motel had no digital system, and the cameras, disconnected months ago. But what they did have was a maintenance shed behind the building, one that wasn't listed on any official records. They got a warrant to search the shed after a local deputy swore he smelled something foul coming from behind the building on a routine patrol. Inside, they found a heavy-duty lock on the door, and the windows had been painted over from the inside. What was in there? I still can't shake it. The place was stuffed wall to wall with discarded clothes, shoes, phones with cracked screens, even a few wallets with IDs still inside. There were claw marks on the inside of the wooden walls, like someone had tried to get out. Worst of all, in the back corner, under a tarp and layers of insulation, they found human remains. Multiple sets, in varying stages of decomposition. One of the motel employees was arrested. He was younger than I expected, mid-30s, name was Craig Sullivan, and apparently he'd been working the night shifts for years. From what I heard, he admitted to escorting guests to the shed under the guise of a room upgrade or late-night maintenance. The terrifying part? The owner of the motel claimed he had no idea any of this was happening. Said Craig lived in one of the vacant units and kept to himself. No one questioned it. He'd been there long enough to blend in, to become part of the background, like a stain you forget's there until it starts to rot. Marcus's body was confirmed through dental records about 3 weeks later. They think he was killed the same night he went missing. Just like that, and someone I lived with, laughed with, shared meals with, gone. His family never spoke to me directly, and I don't blame them. I couldn't do anything to stop it. I didn't even hear it happen. The guilt sits in a quiet part of my mind, always waiting to creep in when it's dark and silent. I keep playing that night over and over, wondering what I missed, wondering if I should have opened that door when I heard the footsteps, if I could have seen the shed sooner. I haven't gone on a road trip since, can't even sleep in motels anymore. I book chain hotels, second floor only, check the locks twice, and even then, I don't sleep well. I still think about that man I saw outside the shed, the one who wasn't moving. Was it Craig? Was Marcus still alive at that moment? I'll never know. I've told this story to a few people over the years, but they always give me that look, like they're not sure if I'm exaggerating or just messed up from the trauma. I don't care anymore. If this post helps even one person think twice before staying somewhere sketchy, then it was worth writing. Just trust your gut. And if something doesn't sit right, leave. Don't wait for it to make sense. It was the year before I graduated, and spring break was pretty much our last shot at doing something wild before real life kicked in. I was studying psychology at a mid-sized college in Georgia, nothing too fancy, and I was sharing a dorm with my best friend at the time, Vanessa. She was the one who found the Airbnb, a beach condo down in Florida, right on the water. There were 4 of us, me, Vanessa, Nicole, and Danny. We weren't the party hard type, but the idea of a few days by the ocean, sipping cheap drinks and sleeping in till noon, sounded like exactly what we needed. We left early that Thursday, spent most of the drive singing along to old playlists and eating gas station snacks, and got there late afternoon. The condo was perfect. White walls, tiled floors, a big sliding glass door that opened onto a balcony facing the beach. That first evening was calm. We walked down to the boardwalk, grabbed greasy fish tacos, then watched the sunset from the sand. We were all in good moods, just laughing about dumb things, who forgot to pack sunscreen, who nearly left their charger at home, that kind of stuff. Before we left for a bar later that night, I remember distinctly checking that the patio door was locked. It was one of those sliding ones with a latch that clicks in place. Vanessa double-checked it right after me, gave me a thumbs up. We weren't paranoid, but it was just habit, especially in a new place. We headed out around 10, hit a local beachside bar, danced a little, and got back close to 2 a.m. Everything seemed normal except the sliding door was open maybe 2 inches. We all paused at the same time when we noticed it. The curtain was fluttering from the breeze coming in, and I remember Nicole saying, "Did one of you open that to air out the place or something?" None of us had. And for a second, we just stood there kind of processing it. It wasn't open wide and nothing looked disturbed. Vanessa even walked over and pointed out that maybe it hadn't latched fully when we left. I wanted to believe that, so we all just kind of nodded along, closed it tight again, and moved on. We were tired, a little buzzed, and brushing it off was easier than letting our minds spiral. We locked up everything again, even checked the windows this time, and all crashed in our rooms. The next morning, it was Danny who said something first. She came into the kitchen holding her suitcase with this confused look on her face. "Did any of you go through my stuff?" she asked. We all said no, of course not. Then she placed it on the counter and unzipped it. Half her clothes were missing, mostly smaller items like swimsuits and tank tops. She said it was zipped shut when she left, and now it was halfway open. At first, we joked it was probably stuffed under the bed, or she just forgot she took it out, but she insisted. She started searching everywhere. We all did. Nothing turned up. That's when I remembered something. The condo had one of those tiny security camera doorbells mounted near the entrance. It wasn't ours, but the app was still logged in on the condo's iPad. Vanessa grabbed the iPad and opened the app. The condo owners had left it on the kitchen counter along with a printed sheet of instructions: how to connect to Wi-Fi, how to operate the smart lock, and a note at the bottom that said the camera feed was viewable if needed. None of us had paid much attention to it until now. The footage was motion-triggered, so we scrolled back to around the time we'd left for the bar the night before. The clips loaded slowly. At first, it just showed us heading out, all dressed up and laughing as we locked the door behind us. Then, about 35 minutes later, there was movement. The clip was short. A tall man appeared on screen, stepping into the frame from the side like he'd been waiting just off camera. He wore a hoodie, dark jeans, and he moved calmly. Too calmly. He didn't hesitate or fumble with the lock. He pulled something out of his pocket, crouched by the door for maybe 10 seconds, and then he was inside. The app recorded exactly 27 minutes of movement inside the unit. He left the same way he came in, through the balcony. There was no footage from the inside, but we could see him exit without rushing, hands in his pockets, as if nothing had happened. That image is burned into my head. A man walking barefoot across the patio tiles like he belonged there. None of us really spoke for a moment. Nicole looked pale, Vanessa had her arms wrapped around herself, and Danny just kept repeating, "That's not okay. That's not okay." We kept trying to make sense of it. Was he a previous guest? A neighbor? Someone who had a key somehow? But the lock was digital and we'd changed the code when we checked in, just like the instructions said. We reported it to the rental platform and called local police. They sent a patrol car out and took our statements, but they didn't seem surprised. "This happens more than people realize," the officer said, almost too casually. He took down some notes, told us to keep the door double locked, and left. That day felt like it dragged on forever. We didn't go to the beach, didn't turn on music, didn't even eat much. Danny kept her bag with her at all times. Nicole checked every window 3 times, and I started noticing little things I hadn't before. How the hallway light flickered faintly, how the floors creaked near the bathroom, how thin the sliding door's glass really was. That night, none of us wanted to sleep alone, so we dragged our blankets into the living room and crashed on the couch and floor, watching dumb reality shows with the volume too low to matter. Every noise outside made us jump. But nothing else happened that night. At least, nothing we noticed. The following morning, we packed. No one said it out loud, but it was obvious. We weren't staying the full week. I called the condo owner and explained what had happened. She sounded genuinely disturbed and promised to review the security settings and talk to the platform. She refunded the remaining nights without argument. We left before noon, tossing our bags into the trunk in silence. It wasn't just about feeling unsafe anymore. It was the sense that someone had been near us, maybe even watching us sleep, and we'd had no clue. That invisible presence had violated something we didn't even know was so fragile. A few days after we got home, Danny texted all of us. She said she found one of the swimsuits that had gone missing, folded neatly in the mailbox at her parents' house. No note, no explanation. It wasn't even mailed, just placed there. Her dad assumed it was a prank by a friend, but Danny was sure it had something to do with that night. She asked if any of us had gotten anything weird, but we hadn't, at least, not that we noticed. That detail messed with all of us. How would someone even know where she lived? None of us had posted about the trip publicly. The idea that whoever that man was might have followed us, or at least one of us, home, that was a whole new level of disturbing. To this day, we still bring it up sometimes when we catch up. None of us ever got any more answers. The police never called back. The rental platform said they escalated it, but nothing ever came of it. It became one of those stories that lives in the back of your head, waiting to bubble up when you check into a hotel or hear a strange noise behind a thin wall. I still lock every door and window twice now, sometimes 3 times. That spring break was supposed to be a memory of sun, drinks, and cheap fun, but instead it's just this shadow. A question we never got to ask, a door that was supposed to stay locked. Sometimes I think about the way he walked out onto that balcony, hands in his pockets like he wasn't in any rush, like it wasn't the first time he'd done that. And maybe it wasn't.